समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Geopolitics with Swasti with our consulting editor and foreign policy expert, Swasti Rao. In this show, we take questions from our members on what's happening across the world, and Swasti tells us why. Thank you so much for joining us after Holi. We were happy to see so many questions from our members. But let's just get started. At Optimist Guy 2011 asks a big one to start off this episode. Can you please explain the present status of the Indian Navy in the wider Indian Ocean context? Why are we not taking up more roles in our backyard? And also, can you throw some light on how the Indian military is perceived by the West?
Now, that's a very comprehensive question. I think it has part of what we can refer to as a question in terms of a query, and also you have certain observations about why India is not taking up roles, etc. So let me take it up one by one. Now, for the basics, right, we have to set the context right, which is that, of course, as you know, that India's geographical location is right there in the center of the Indian Ocean region, and India is the most formidable actor when it comes to the Indian Ocean theatre. Now, there are no doubts about it. But to say that we always had a maritime vision, which was very inclusive of what our roles could have been in the Indian Ocean region, that's not the case, really. It was always there somewhere in our strategic, I would say, the list of priorities, but it never really came on the top as much as it started doing after 2014. So, India's first, so to say, maritime doctrine did come sometime in 2004, and then it was upgraded in 2005, eventually in 2009. But the real push, started coming only after 2014. However, there's a range of factors that you need to understand if you need to properly, understand what role are we playing. So the first thing, I mean, the way I look at it is that one is that what are our capabilities, which is a very basic thing in terms of how many warships, how many destroyers, how many frigates, and I can give you a long list. I have compiled a few as well. But that's one. So capabilities is one aspect. The other aspect is what have been the frameworks, right? So I told you about this first maritime doctrine. It was only in 2009 that the doctrine was actually upgraded to a strategy. And India, the phrase that we started using for our maritime vision was that from using the seas, we started securing the seas. And that probably can tell you the shift that we went through in terms of playing a much larger role. And it also came around the same time when the entire West, the bigger players were getting more and more conscious about freedom of navigation and securing access to the sea lanes of communication, the slogs, because these are global commons, right? And if you want to keep them free and open and inclusive, you have to play a role. And therefore, this entire thing of how India was striving to become a blue water navy, etc. So the second is that framework. There's a set of frameworks that has helped India get there. And perhaps the third would be our aspirations, right? So aspirations, when I say it, is about what kind of security threats are there now, what are we doing to sort of deal with them. And frankly, end of the day, there is also this competition which is unfolding.
Yeah.
So going by these three things, you can get an assessment of what really is Indian Navy doing. So quickly, in terms of capabilities, and before I come there, one has to admire certain things about the Indian Navy. Is that if you look at the three forces, Army, Air Force, and Navy, and out of the total defense budget that the armed forces get, the Navy gets the smallest share. Now, in many ways, this is not convincing because, if you look at the ratio of our land mass to our EEZ, you will see that even though there's very little difference, but in terms of the budget that the Navy gets, it's always the smallest, right? And with that small budget, the Indian Navy has been focusing on indigenization addition, they have been focusing on, developing a lot of domestic capabilities. They also have tried to sort of, with whatever budgeting they have, try to be as professional as possible and also rise up to the occasion. And that is why you see that today India has a reputation of being the first responder. India has a reputation of being a net security provider and also a formidable humanitarian actor. There are different ways through which we do that. So that one thing, I think you have to give it to the Indian Navy, that they have done it better than compared to others, because the budgeting issue is a common issue for everybody, but with whatever they have done a better job. So the first thing. Now the second thing is about the capabilities. And as I said, that the capabilities alone don't tell you much, but the capabilities can give you an idea that India does have 2 aircraft carriers. India does have, about 140, front warships. India has frigates, corvettes, destroyers, different classes. Indian, also has the Rafale Marines now for one of the aircraft carriers, etc. So, I mean, there's a long list, and frankly, you can just Google it and you can find it. So that's one which is already there in the open domain. India has about 18 functional submarines, and we are developing different kinds of submarines, etc. There is also, if you look at the recent plans of the Navy, there are plans to get into more underwater drone acquisitions, etc. So I think that capability is one factor. The other factor is the frameworks, and I think that is where we need to understand things a little better, because when I said that India wants to emerge as the first respondent, India is a first respondent, India is a humanitarian actor, a net security provider. So there are different ways in which India does it. So the Sagar came in 2015, which is security and growth for all in the region, and then which was then very well complemented by Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, the IPOI, and eventually, then there is the IORA, IONS, IFC IOR, etc., which is in Gurgaon. So these are frameworks through which India gets into more, I would say, joint operations, capacity building of smaller states, etc. So that is one part that India has done very well. In fact, there is one mention that I must do, Vandana, which is the Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to Mauritius, because it's directly related to what we're discussing on Indian Navy right now. Now, there is a group of 6 island countries that are extremely important in the Western Indian Ocean region. And these 6 island countries are Mauritius, Maldives, Madagascar, Comoros, and Sri Lanka. And if you see how China keeps playing a role in Maldives, in Sri Lanka, and in all these places, you know that India needs to double down on these island countries in order to sort of revamp its naval posture. Now, very quickly, just on Mauritius, there are certain things that one needs to know. Now, Mauritius, of course, India, out of all these 6 countries that I just mentioned, I think the deepest relationship that India has been with the Mauritius because of so many cultural and civilizational factors. But not just that, something very important happened in 1982, because UNCLOS became adopted. UNCLOS was adopted, and after the adoption of UNCLOS, these very tiny island nations became huge ocean states with hundreds of kilometers of EEZ around them, and their leverage in the seas was enhanced in a big way. Right, there was a paradigm shift, and therefore it makes a lot of sense for India, because we also need to project our naval power. We also need to sort of counter China's unilateral attempts to change the status quo. And for that, if you carefully see the Indian Navy's, overtures, especially you say for a country like Mauritius. So in Mauritius, there is a set of islands called the Agelaga Islands, and India has been developing infrastructure there. Then there is a little island there called Reunion, which is French territory, where India has access. We have a reciprocal arrangement with the French on that. Similarly, India is also developing its, individual, outreach in the region. And all of this put together is how India is really looking at its, role as a net security provider, as a blue water navy, etc., etc. And you asked me a question on how it is perceived by the West, right? Now, very quickly, of course, all the Western countries recognize India's central role in the Indian Ocean theater and the larger Indo-Pacific. And the testament to this particular statement is that you pick up any Indo-Pacific strategy, whether it's by the French or the Americans or the Germans
British,
or the European Union, whoever that may be, you will always see that there are certain actors that are finding repeated mentions, and of course India is being one of them. So especially after 2018, when Trump administration, remember the first Trump administration, changed their focus from the CENTCOM to Indo-Pacific Command. It was earlier called PACOM, and then they renamed it to Indo-Pacific Command. You will see that India became and emerged as this major player, because India is a democratic country. India is 1.5 billion people. India is also very centrally located in the Indian Ocean region and is a key player, like from what I just told you. So whether for all these countries, and that also translates to a lot of these joint exercises and operations. So whether it's the Quad, whether it's the Malabar exercises that we do with the Quad countries, whether it's bilateral exercises that we do with the French or other multinational exercises, we also do it with Russia. All these countries. There are also EU naval force missions that we have been on board. For example, the Operation Atalanta, etc. So whenever there's piracy, whenever there's these kind of things, India has always been very, I would say, on point, and that has collectively built India's reputation as a major naval force, which is committed to free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, which is committed to freedom of navigation operations, which is committed to, respecting the rules-based order because of China's growing, I would say, dominance in the seas. So I think you have to, when you say how should we understand Indian Navy, you have to put together all of these things and not merely capabilities per se, because even though, for example, numerically, China has more capabilities, okay, than the US, but the US Navy, in terms of its, power, would outdo China any day. It depends on how you sort of define it. And frankly, at the end of the day, India is not a country that is looking at forward bases or something. So from India's perspective and what kind of maritime vision we have, I think what we are doing is very good. And of course, there is room for improvement. Like I said, India has to get its act together for underwater drones and stuff. But that said, I think the Indian Navy is, in my opinion, probably the most professional of our armed forces, and they're doing a great job.
Swasti, moving to another part of the neighborhood now. This is a slightly philosophical question from one of our subscribers, Palos, who asks, has China gone soft on India? Or and he brings in Trump here, right? Trump also is looking to be open for resolution with Iran, weaning away from China. So to him, he says it looks like behind all of this bravado, China seems to be particularly concerned. How do things stand between India and China in the era of Trump?
See, first of all, the era of Trump. It's just been a few weeks that he's come to the White House formally, and he's been too fast and he's been too furious. So Trump 2.0 has been too fast and too furious. Despite that, I would say that when you're trying to assess what is going to be Trump's implication of Trump administration on all these factors, I would say that Trump right now is bit of a Schrodinger's cat, which is dead and alive at the same time. So take it with a pinch of salt. I think strategic patience is what we require. I do not see a long-term rapprochement happening between the US and China, because Trump is going to be in the US for 4 years, right? And even after 2 years, one is not sure whether he's going to have majority in both houses or not. So just we have to take it with a pinch of salt. We have to develop strategic caution and patience, because I am not of the opinion that there's going to be long-term rapprochement. There is going to be a major rivalry between the US and China, because China out there is trying to close the capabilities gap with the US, whether it's the Navy, whether it's the outer space, whether it's whatever. And you can see that the way Trump is doubling down on the minerals deals, etc., is also testimony to the fact that America knows that they have to somewhere, if they want to ace the semiconductor game and the chips game. Right now, the capability gap is there, but it would be closed very soon, especially after DeepSeek and all that. So I don't see the long-term rapprochement. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in the short term, however, Trump has been a disruptor himself. So if there's one disruptor to the global order, that's been Trump himself. And that's why I called him a bit of a Schrodinger's cat, which is dead and alive at the same time, and you don't really know where it is. Now, quickly connecting it to India, you see, one thing that Indians perhaps need to understand better is that we are not on China's priority. Okay, so India is not really what is keeping Xi Jinping awake at night. Okay, it is his rhetoric on Taiwan. It is his rhetoric on his domestic issues, on several things, his slowing down, the Chinese economy slowing down, etc. If you carefully see, I think China, Xi Jinping, his administration, his team, CCP, they have been extremely conservative and extremely reticent on whatever's happening in the world. They have hardly come out with anything. They've hardly come out with any statements. And when it comes to India, see, it is in China's interest to normalize relations with India because they would not want another front. See, if what is really taking their, I would say, mind space is the question of Taiwan, is the question of Indo-Pacific, is the question of the South China Sea, and all the ganging up that they see happening against them. And in that situation, their problem on the LAC, right, that there they have a different strategy. They are not looking at an all-out war at all. They are looking at salami slicing. They know that the power differential with India is huge. Okay, India is no match to China when it comes to capabilities. The thing is that it is not as in China's interest to go for an all-out war against us. So there will not be an all-out war. We have nuclear deterrence as well. But right now, we are not their priority. They know that India is going to be dependent on Chinese imports because out of the $120 billion worth of trade we have, more than $100 billion is the deficit. And one thing that we all need to understand and recognize here is that the more India exports to the West, the more India lands up importing from China because we are not
Still
a manufacturing base. We are not a manufacturing base. We are still reliant on China for so many raw materials and API and so on and so forth. So please understand that there's a bit of an illusion happening here in the global economy because even though the West is not buying directly from China in defense of de-risking, but the fact that they are importing for more from India is actually just a rerouting happening right now. It is not really translating into a strong manufacturing base for India, and that is a battle that we have to fight because it means changes at so many different levels. It means getting more investment. It means getting more of that. So coming again, looking at the Trumpian disorder, it is absolutely in India's interest to also keep the relations normal because of the trade deficit, because of the tactical disengagement that we have been trying, we have had to some extent. Of course, there's disengagement, not de-escalation on LAC in certain sectors. But that said, there's been a resumption of certain flights between India and China, which was suspended for long and all. So this little normalization that you see is in India's interest because, frankly, like I said, because Trump is extremely unpredictable. So India should not be keeping all its eggs in the American basket when it comes to tackling China. Because please remember that earlier India was also using Russia to balance China. And after the Russia-Ukraine war for the last 3 years, because Russia's pushed so much with China, I mean, India's strategy would work all the time. I'm not very sure about it. So then eventually India started to bank on US for balancing China. So I think it is perfectly in India's interest that US-Russia relations normalize. India-China relations are also below the threshold of war, etc. Not to say that you can trust the Chinese, but it is in India's interest. To say that this is going to resolve the LAC problem or this is going to resolve China's approach to Indo-Pacific, no, not at all. In fact, I have myself argued several times that the real problem is, even hypothetically speaking, if tomorrow the LAC problem was resolved, but China will always be a competitor because China believes in a multipolar world but a unipolar Asia, which is led by China. India, on the contrary, believes in a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia, right? So these worldviews cannot be reconciled. So that containment of India's rise in the region and in the world, larger Indo-Pacific, will always is a stated goal of the CCP, which is not going anywhere. So when you say softening, I think perhaps you have to sort of adjust your level of analysis and see that, okay, in a tactical sense it is happening because this is perhaps what Trump is pushing for. Right? It is perfectly logical, but do not expect larger strategic shifts there or paradigm shifts there or structural resolution to our problems because those problems have structural reasons. So in short, look at it like that. It is a level of analysis problem. And I would argue that at a lower level, tactically makes sense. At a higher level, let's not buy this argument that China suddenly has found
Gone
love for
soft.
India. We
Yeah.
are not really there on their strategic priority, and they're just playing us.
Thanks, Swasti. That's actually a really good segue into our next question, which is also after after you put out a call to action in our last episode. It's our first question from a female, from a woman subscriber, a woman member. So at Shreya3224 asks, "I am a woman and I love the show," and she says, "My question is, are we going to actually see a multipolar world in the near future? As a citizen of this world, I ask myself, what would I prefer to live in? Would it be a world where there is a Western alliance at the top of the hierarchy, or are there benefits to being citizens of a multipolar world? So, what is better for the world in your opinion? Are we heading towards a multipolar alignment?"
See, we are already living in a multipolar world. Depends on how you choose to define it. Okay, and why I say the definitions are important. I'll give you a sense of why the definition is so important. So I have been arguing for a while now, and that you have to look at. We are not looking in one ubiquitous world order, right? There is a security order in the world, which is clearly dominated by America, and where China is trying to close the gap. And I just gave you in the previous questions also, when I was answering, I said that how is China sort of trying to catch up with the US, etc. So we are living in. So if you look at the global security order, it is still dominated by the United States, but China is trying to close the gap, right? If you look at the international or the global economic order, you see more multipolarity, because even though United States is world's largest economy by the size of the GDP, it's close to 30 trillion. But despite that, you do not see that Trump alone can really call the shots. Now, just a very good example can be given from all his tariff rhetoric. So you saw that he talked about slapping tariffs, but when Mexico and Canada stood their grounds, he said that okay, I'm willing to change, etc. So that's just one very recent example. The other examples can be given from the fact that there is a grouping called the BRICS groupings, which is a grouping of countries that are not really classically in the Western G7 frameworks, and that really, I would say, hold a fair share of the world economy. I mean, of course, by definition, if there's China, that's going to be a major part of world economy. But even otherwise, there's a group of OPEC countries, for instance, that really control a lot of oil politics and geopolitics around it. So what I'm trying to say, the sheer fact that the G7 alone is not sufficient, and the G7 needs something like a G20 to survive, I think all these things, the nature of financial crises, the fact that the economies of skill, which are the G7, cannot survive without the economies of scale, right? So because of all these things, you do see that when it comes to the global economic order, you see that there's more multipolarity, even though there is an undisputed leader right now. But even then, there is more multipolarity, because one person alone really cannot call the shots. We have seen that Donald Trump could not do it, okay, even with Mexico and Canada. Okay. And then there is a global digital order. The global digital order is the order which is, frankly, dependent upon all these technological innovations, the artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, the chips, and all machine learning and stuff like that, which Yuval Harari keeps talking about and writing about. So in this particular order, frankly, right now, it's the contours are emerging. One is still trying to figure out what is happening. But the special thing, the speciality, that special feature about the global digital order is that whoever is going to dominate the global digital order will come to dominate both the security order and the economic order. Why? Because today's dual use, all these things, especially when it comes to AI, the applications are so varied and so intersectional and cross-sectional that you cannot really think you cannot really put these things in silos and watertight compartments. So the nature of economic security is such, the nature of military technology is such that AI and all these things are going to play a more important role as days go by. So even though the global digital order is still I mean, it's getting formed now. There is, we are only coming out with regulations and investments and so on and so forth. But the nature is such. So perhaps what we need to understand better is that we are already living in a very intersectional moment when it comes to the global order and the multipolar order, whichever way you want to look at it. But clearly it is not unipolar.
Yeah.
Now, like I said, that I just gave you a picture of how I look at this multipolarity, and this can you could have a difference of opinion there, but for sure it is not a classic unipolar or a bipolar world. That's not the case. And even though sometimes the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, you say that, okay, it's Russia and the United States that have to sit at the big table and frankly others don't have agency, but that's not really working out, because if that was the case, the war would have been over by now. If US was calling the shots, everything would be okay in the Middle East by now. Everything would be okay in the East European theater by now. But all these things are really deeply entwined, and that give a very, very different flavor to the world we live in. And in fact, Amitav Acharya, the famous international relations expert, has given a very good idea about it. He said that we are so much used to looking at the world like a unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. He says actually what we live in is a very multiplex world order, which is all embedded at the same time and all very dynamic at the same time. So you cannot really lay a finger and say that this is where we are, but for sure it's not unipolar or bipolar. So we're living in a very complex world here.
Now, Swasti, I thought that we have quite a few questions on where things stand with the Ukraine-Russia ceasefire. So I thought we'll group some of them. The first one is from Kartik Parashar, who asks, what are the objectives of the ceasefire? Who stands to gain from it? And is Donald Trump thinking about the Nobel Peace Prize with this ceasefire?
Thanks, Vandana. And thank you, Karthik, because I think you are one of the most consistent members. And frankly, I don't think there's any Geopolitics with Swasti that we have done so far without a question from you. So thank you.
Thanks.
Now, about the ceasefire. Now, for sure, the ceasefire demands by Ukraine and the ceasefire demands by Russia are different, okay? And that's the thing. That's a great psychological tactic, because when you ask for almost everything, then you'll get away at least with something. Okay, so I think that's a good psychological tactic. Very quickly, what Putin wants is a complete subjugation of Ukraine, complete neutrality of Ukraine, no NATO membership, of course, but no European troops in Ukraine either. And then he wants so basically complete demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine. That still pretty much stays. And then, of course, the 4 annexed territories should be with Russia, etc. So that's what Putin wants. I think those maximalist objectives have not changed at all. When it comes to Ukraine, I think in principle, of course, they know that they will always say that territory is theirs, but they know that in reality, it's practically speaking, it's very difficult for Ukraine to get back their territory. I think the question is not of territory anymore. The question is that of neutrality, and the question is that of capitulation on Russia's terms. So I think that is what Ukraine says, and Ukraine says that there will not be any ceasefire in the absence of real guarantees. Now, what those guarantees are, the jury is, my God, completely out, on this, because of course NATO, if they want NATO, Article 5, that is not coming. And in fact, the way Donald Trump administration, especially with JD Vance, etc., have been diluting the flavor of NATO 5, I think very frankly, it would really lose that leverage also, right? I mean, why would anybody want an Article 5 if there's no US backstop? So coming very quickly to your question, which is that both Russia and Ukraine, again, they have a very incommensurable solution or incommensurable plan for what they want from the ceasefire. Now, very quickly, what has happened is that just as everybody was trying to wrap their heads around the fact that America has cut off military assistance and intelligence to Ukraine, which had been a very, very major part of how Ukraine was fighting this war, just 2 days ago, around midnight, when it was midnight in India, Rubio and the Ukrainian side had a successful breakthrough, which was hosted by Saudi Arabia again. And there, with immediate effect, the military assistance and intelligence sharing was resumed. And why? Because Ukraine agreed in principle that it is ready for a 30-day ceasefire. And by this action, suddenly, Marco Rubio has now put the ball in Russia's court, so that Russia has to agree to it. Now, for about 48 hours, there was no real statement. I don't think there's any real statement, but there are a couple of statements that have come from President Putin when he went to Kursk, because in Kursk, Russia is regaining its territory that the Ukrainians had taken. So he went to Kursk in military uniform and camouflage, etc. And there he said certain statements which are being treated as Putin's response to what has happened. He
Right.
still has not given a formal official statement, but from what is obvious is that Putin has rejected the idea that there would be a ceasefire unless all these maximalist objectives are met, which I listed earlier. On the Ukrainian side, right now they seem to be in a more comfortable position because, see, frankly, what is happening on the battlefield is that that it's a stalemate. If there is territory that Russia is taking in terms of a village here or a village there, then there's a village here or a village there that Ukraine is also taking. So when you zoom out the battlefield dynamic, you see that there's a bit of a stalemate out there. What is Ukraine's real vulnerabilities are attacks on critical infrastructure like the power grids, etc., and civilian attacks. And for that, they were really dependent on the air defenses that America was giving them and the intelligence sharing. Otherwise, I have been arguing, if you remember, Vandana, that if it is only about the battlefront, Ukraine can go on fighting like that for the next 2 years, right?
Yeah.
They have enough drones. They have already compensated for the lack of their manpower and lack of ammunition with drones. They have their annual capacity right now is 1.5 million drones. Okay. By the way, do you know what is India's annual capacity for drones right now? It's 10,000 drones, and we intend to take it up to 60,000 drones towards the end of 2029. So what I'm saying is that it doesn't take a genius to really find out what is happening on the battlefront. So if the Ukrainians are able to convince the Americans to give them the military assistance and intelligence sharing back and put the ball in Russia's court, then frankly, Ukraine right now, it has lost the territory, but there is no reason for Ukraine to capitulate on Russia's terms, okay? And that is why these two ideas, these two aspirations remain so incommensurable. So that was the first part.
Right.
Yeah.
And I want to follow up on this. We have another member at Pavan Kumar who asks, whose question is about the involvement of Europe and where Europe stands with the ceasefire. So now we have a lot of European leaders who've come out. Their support has been consistent, but now it's becoming even louder, right?
Yeah.
So how does this really affect the geopolitics of Europe in the European theater?
It's a very good question. You know why? Because the one strategic mistake that we are constantly making, also in India, is that when we are talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, we are speaking as if neither Ukraine has any agency nor Europe has any agency. I mean, just look at the arguments. The arguments are extremely simplistic. And if that was the case, by now everything should have been sorted. No, if Europe really had no agency, if Ukraine really had no agency, then by now things would have concluded. It would have been a forgotten war, because if really it was only the US and Russia that had the agency here. That's not true, and that's neither true nor is it sufficient to understand what is happening on the battleground. In terms of Europe, see, what has happened is that I'll give you 5-6 points to tell you what has really happened. What has Russia's war in Ukraine done to Europe? If you carefully see Europe and the EU, which was a geo-economic bloc, the biggest paradigm shift that you see for the bloc is its military transformation. This military transformation is happening at two levels. Yes, they are slow because of the way of spending. And I've told you that for Europe to change the way it is acting, it has to change the way it is spending, and especially with respect to all the constitutional debt breaks, etc. Before big economies like Germany, for the European Union itself. And I in the last episode, I gave you a good breakdown of what really is Europe doing in terms of freeing up space for member states to take more debt when it comes to defense modernization. And I told you the number, which is 650 billion euros. Okay. So anyway, coming back, the first thing is that the military transformation of Europe, look at individual member states. Could anybody have imagined that for the biggest economy of Europe, which is Germany, you would have a CDU leader, Friedrich Merz, who would come? He's the biggest committed transatlantic. All his career, he's been the biggest committed transatlanticist. Okay, and here is this man who's going to enter into coalition. Of course, German politics is all about coalitions.
The Grand Coalition.
And there is already news that he has decided to send not only more military aid to Ukraine, but also the Taurus missiles. Okay, and Taurus missiles have a lot of strategic significance in terms of what Ukraine can then do to Russia. Okay, so that's one. The other thing that he has done is about removing the debt brake. And I've told you that the chabi is there. That's the magic wand. If they whatever plans they come up with, if they're not removing, that's what Olaf Scholz's administration tried and failed,
Failed to
Vandana,
do, yeah.
because they said that 100 billion euros for military transformation and modernization, but they did not really remove the debt brake,
Right.
and therefore they couldn't do it. So if Mayors is saying all that, if Mayors is saying that Europe needs to now not bank upon Article 5 of NATO,
Or
etc.,
depend on America.
yeah, and it's Europe's biggest economy. You already know what is France doing, what are
Yeah.
different individual member states doing. So the military transformation, modernization that is happening at three levels, if I can tell you. Member state level, of course, the individual member state countries like Poland, Germany, France, Italy, blah, 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 all these countries. The second level is the EU-wide level
Right.
that I gave a lot of details about
Yeah,
in
in
the
our
last
last
Geopolitics.
episode.
And the third level is also the NATO level. See, I think what somewhere we are not able to understand, because the entire discussion has been on the Article 5. NATO itself, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has embarked upon massive modernization programs for themselves. I'm not talking about whether they're going to take in Ukraine or not. It's about themselves. The kind of money that NATO members have committed under the unified command, the NATO command, okay, for tackling hybrid threats, etc. That's massive. And trust me, for decades this was overlooked. For decades, because there was no threat in Europe.
Right.
So these kind of things are going to fundamentally alter the power dynamics of the European continent, and this is something that we are not able to see right now, because everybody is just talking about when the war in Ukraine will end or not. So that's the
Yeah.
first thing. The second thing is that Russia's war in Ukraine pushed the latest NATO expansion with respect to Sweden and Finland.
Yeah.
And also this is very, very consequential, because minus Sweden and Finland have been neutral for 150 years almost,
yeah.
okay? And in the absence of somebody like Sweden and Finland, basically the Baltic front of the NATO, which is the three Baltic countries, was extremely vulnerable. And in fact, if you look into the details of the NATO papers, their brainstorming about their capabilities, it's always the Baltic vulnerability. Always the Baltic vulnerability that they wanted to compensate for,
Improve,
and they
yeah.
couldn't, because there was no real
Yeah.
threat, okay? But suddenly, with Finland and Sweden joining, and both Finland and Sweden have very advanced military industrial complexes as well as military capabilities. Okay, so that itself has been a major setback for Russia. Okay, and the third, which people do not really talk about too much, is the factor of how Ukraine is now turning into this live laboratory of innovation, technological,
Yeah.
military innovation. This is nothing short of a revolution. Nobody imagined that there would be a war where a massive adversary like Russia could be held
For this long,
could be held back for this long by the use of missiles and drones and intelligence and all that. And the implications of all these factors that I'm telling you about, these implications are going to be permanent in nature. Even if Ukraine's territories are not coming back to it, that's frankly not the point here. Everybody knows the reality, right? The fact is that what can Ukraine, with that 1.5 million drone capabilities, the long-standing defense industry cooperations that Ukraine has with Europe's biggest defense industries like Rheinmetall in Germany and the French and the Swedes and all that, all of that is going to radically transform. So I think it's really, I would say, short-sighted to not recognize the Europeans have agency. And this leads to all kinds of wrong interpretations about this war, there, because one tends to, you keep hearing these arguments that, oh, Ukraine is going to turn the Afghanistan for the US, or Vietnam for the US, etc. Those were not in that immediate theater. For Europe, the thing is different because it's their continent. They will. And why do you think that if the US relationship was so crucial, and it is crucial, but it was so decisive, by now the Europeans should have really left Ukraine? No, they
Yeah,
should have abandoned Ukraine, because that was the expectation, that if Donald Trump comes and cuts off aid or tries to bring about this paradigm shift towards its relationship with the Russians, which he's doing, the Europeans really wouldn't have too much choice but to follow suit, because they don't have capabilities. But frankly, what is happening is something which is completely exceptional.
Yeah, the opposite.
It will take time to show results. I would still have very mixed views on how much result can it achieve in the short term, but in the long term, it's a paradigm shift. So I think we need to, when we are talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, we have to take into account what agency are we according to which actor. I think there has been a tendency of sort of legitimizing certain actors and under legitimizing certain actors, and because of which, frankly, we have not been able to get our assessment of the Russia-Ukraine war right. I mean, that's been one of the reasons. And even now, if the ceasefire was so easy to achieve, it would have happened by now. But now you see that the war probably is not ending, at least in the near future, because the incommensurable demands are such. So I think we are in for a lot more escalation before things start to cool down.
And now for our last question on this topic, Swasti. Anubhav Saxena asks, what leverage does the US actually have over Russia? Will Russia ever listen to Trump? Because so much of this hinges on, these kinds of hypotheticals. And if Russia will listen to what Trump has to say or offer, what will that be?
So frankly, what kind of leverage does the US have on Russia? Couple of things here. The first thing is that yes, let's just start from acknowledging the fact that Donald Trump does have a very favorable view of Russia and of Putin. There is no doubt about that. That's very clear. But does that suffice to say that the US also has the same leverage? Because of course, Donald Trump, going by his statements, they are all over the place. He's constantly saying that Putin calls me a genius and Putin likes me and I like him. He's going to listen to me. Now, if we want to deconstruct it a little bit, frankly, what leverage? Two kinds of leverage. One is financial leverage, fiscal, basically.
Right.
What it means is that when Donald Trump says that if, for example, if you remember, there were a couple of days ago, or maybe 3-4 days ago, there was Russia had launched a massive missile attack, and that was a time when Americans had cut off their intelligence to Ukraine. So he gave a very controversial statement, and because everybody was thinking that Trump has gone completely pro-Putin, and then he said that if Russia keeps on pounding Ukraine like that, then I will slap the tightest possible sanctions. Now one wonders what kind, and that is where you have to understand that indeed when it comes to sanctions, there is certain leverage that America holds over Russia. I'll tell you what they are. The first is that not all Russian banks are right now cut off from SWIFT. There are certain Russian banks that are cut off, but a lot of them are not cut off. So President Trump can cut off the remaining Russian banks from SWIFT, maybe leaving one or two. That is a major, I would say, leverage. The second leverage is that America can sanction Russia's shadow fleet. And if the shadow fleet is sanctioned, okay, it is going to be very bad news, because that on the regular fleet, of course, there are sanctions imposed, coordinated sanctions imposed, but they don't work as intended because Russia has already built a shadow fleet. Okay, now if there are sanctions on the shadow fleet as well, it would be a problem for Russia right now in the short term. Again, in the long term, there would be structural adjustments that always happens. This is a game of cat and mouse, that you put some sanctions and then there are ways to circumvent those sanctions, and then new sanctions are put, and then ways to circumvent those sanctions. So all that keeps happening. But in the short term, yes, it would be trouble. The third thing would be about the frozen assets again. Now, when it comes to frozen assets, frankly, US does not have as much leverage as the Europeans have, for the simple fact that out of the $350 billion that are frozen in, those are Russia's foreign exchange reserves, which are frozen. It's basically the EU that holds most of the reserves. America doesn't hold so many reserves, okay? So what can they do is that, yes, there is now, you see, there is a lot of political currency and support to the fact that why should the US taxpayers or the European taxpayers pay for their assistance? And Russia should pay for it. And if you see that they have already started using the interest earned on those frozen reserves to be sent back to Ukraine. There is still not, I would say, solid consensus on liquidating the foreign reserves themselves, because that would create a very wrong precedent, and then other countries would be very wary of actually parking their foreign reserves in these currencies, especially euros and dollars, because tomorrow if there's a war, if there's a political difference of opinion, then Europe or America can liquidate them. So it will be a very, very wrong fiscal precedent to set, but it is leverage. There is no doubt about that, okay? And frankly, the last point is that, listen, we have to take care of the numbers here as well. US is a 30 trillion economy, right? Europe, along with UK, is about 24-25 trillion economy, okay? Russia is a 2 trillion economy. So, and speaking about leverage, the the economic relationship that the US has with countries like Mexico, Canada,
Yeah,
the topmost trading partners, with the EU, with
the
China.
rest of the
I
world.
mean, you
Yeah.
cannot even compare it with the trading relationship that America has with the US. So that also gives America a lot of leverage,
Mhm.
frankly, right? Because the more trading you have, the more you're constrained,
Mhm.
you know. Uh, long and short is that yes, Trump does have certain leverage when it comes to these factors over Russia. Now, the other part of this leverage is the political leverage. You
Mhm.
know, I think Trump is somebody that really goes with this personal style in politics. He likes strong men. He has always been fond of Putin, and he thinks that, you know, the strong men have to sit down and talk. So I think Trump has a very personalized views of what he can do, what he cannot do, etc. He likes to take credit. And please understand, even though he keeps saying make America great again and
Mhm.
stuff like
Mhm.
that, but frankly he's only interested in himself. So he is a narcissistic personality, you know, you can see it out and out. And his style of politics is also very personal. So he has a lot of confidence that he is going to get Putin agree to the terms that he says, like for
Yeah, and
yeah.
bring him to.
But I am not sure if Putin is itna kacha khiladi, you know,
Mm.
frankly. I think for Putin, there are a couple of setbacks that he has to keep into account if he wants to play the longer game. Of course, Putin is in for the long game. Couple of factors that Putin has to watch out for, that contrary to what everybody expected, that when Donald Trump comes and says that I want rapprochement with Russia and I
Mm.
don't really want to waste too much of my time in the Russia-Ukraine war and I want to focus on the Indo-Pacific, the Europeans will say, okay, what can we do? We don't really have the
Yeah, we
capabilities.
don't have a
But the
choice.
sheer fact that Europe, along with UK and Turkey is not a member of the
Mhm.
EU so far, they have sort of solidified their support. They have come up with extremely coordinated decisions on supporting Ukraine for the longer haul. That itself is something that Putin would not have wanted, because, and
Yeah.
that's not the narrative either. Because if you look at the Russian narrative today, it's like according no agency to Europe at all.
Yeah.
It's just like
Yeah.
we are not talking to Europe. We are not talking to Europe. But just like Russia is an inalienable part of Europe's geography, so is Europe an inalienable part of Russian geography. So don't go by narrative. I think it's much more important to take these things I mean, in an objective fashion. I think this is something that Putin would not have wanted.
Mm.
Putin would not have wanted Europe to transform like this, and that is why you see so much of this, you know, naysaying, which is like, oh yeah, the Europeans can't do it, the Europeans can't do it. Like I said, in the short term they can't, but then if they really tend to arm themselves and militarize and all that, it would be a very different Europe. And that's what I keep saying, that it would be a different world order. So in terms of leverage, yes, US has certain leverage. That's one. The second thing that I really want to say, Vandana, is that, you know, I think we need to speak about the fact that when it comes to the battle itself, I'm not sure how long can President Putin keep selling the narrative of Russian victory in Ukraine.
Mm.
Because like I keep saying, that yes, indeed, the annexed territories will go to Russia,
Yeah.
but right now where the war is, okay, can you tell me, if I asked you what was Russia's last strategic victory in Ukraine? It was Avdiivka. After that, you may be hearing of all these places where fighting is going on, especially in that axis, right, in the towards the east side of Ukraine. Pokrovsk, it's not
Mm.
captured. How
Mm.
many months we've been hearing about the battle in
Mm.
Pokrovsk? Toriesk, not captured. In fact, Toriesk was the town, the village that Ukraine
It
actually
was recently liberated. Yeah.
liberated. Chasiv Yar. For
Mm.
months now, Russia has been fighting in Chasiv Yar, not captured. Konstantinovka,
Mm.
not captured. In fact, far from being captured, right? Kupiansk,
Mm.
not captured. The Liman-Kupiansk axis, not in Russia's favor. So what I'm trying to tell you here, Black Sea Fleet, one third of it is gone. So see, for President Putin's ceasefire plans and all of that to make sense, time is a vector.
Mm.
The longer it stretches, right, it becomes very difficult to convince Americans or Donald Trump of the fact that we are winning the war, because indeed the annexed territories are there, but the fighting, what it has shown is that Russia, world's number 2 military superpower, is not able to win militarily a
Mm.
battle which is still localized, frankly, okay? And like I said, the Ukraine's vulnerabilities are different. I've been
Yeah,
saying it again
yeah.
and again. The vulnerabilities, lack of air defenses,
Yeah.
and therefore all the attacks on Ukrainian
Land, yeah.
all that. But militarily speaking, it's very difficult to sell the narrative that Russia's winning the war. If you, I can ask you to go back to this theaterization worldview that I did with the three
We
very
link it.
senior armed forces, personnel, and then we talked about the Russia-Ukraine war and the stalemate. So I think what President Putin also needs to keep in mind, that even though psychologically speaking, of course, there is no doubt about the fact that Ukraine cannot get its territory back, and it's demoralizing for them. But the sheer fact that Ukraine has shown immense capabilities to strike deep into Russia almost every day, destroy 1/3 of Russian Black Sea Fleet, and on the battlefront, right, they are not letting Russia advance. With this level of advance, it is going to take years for Russia
Yeah,
to
really
actually
win
come to
the-
their
yeah.
claim lines. Okay, so this needs to be taken much more seriously by Putin. I think, frankly, they should be changing their military tactics and trying to achieve swift victories, because only Avdiivka was really a clear victory. And by now, they should really remove all Ukrainians from Kursk, which they are close to doing. But frankly, that's Russian territory. That's not Ukrainian territory. So battlefront wise, also, I would say that this is also a little fragile, situation where if too much time passes, then it's difficult to sell it to Donald Trump. So
Right.
these are the different ways that
Yeah,
I
things
see that US
unfolding.
has certain leverage. And right now, the fact that US has reinstated military cooperation and intelligence sharing as well, again, shows that, and if you look at Marco Rubio's statements, which have become much more not as pro-Russia as they were. So
Yeah.
like I said, right now, we are dealing with a Schrodinger's cat, but
We don't,
this
yeah.
particular war is not ending tomorrow, at least. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that, Swasti. Thanks for sharing your insights with us again this week. And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Vandana.